Welcome. So this lecture is going to build on the textbook reading on Ronald Reagan and his legacy. To start, Reagan emerged as a conservative slowly. As a young man, he was a liberal. He voted for FDR 4 times. He later wrote that he was a New Dealer to the core. His father found employment during the Depression through the New Deal's Work Relief Administration. Reagan had just graduated college at the beginning of the Great Depression. He found a job broadcasting college football games in Davenport, Iowa, and then moved on to Wrigley Field, announcing games for the Chicago Cubs. And he remained a committed liberal Democrat from the 1930s to the early 1950s. He was president of his union, the Screen Actors Guild, from 1947 to 1952 and 1959 to 1960. He also joined many liberal organizations and political campaigns. There are really 2 reasons he began to move to the right in the 1950s. And so first, he thought that liberals didn't go far enough to go after communists inside the United States. And second, for the first time in his life, he started to make big money and thought that too much of that money was going to taxes. And so in 1952, for the first time, he voted Republican for Dwight Eisenhower. And in 1954, he signed on to host General Electric Theater, where he honed his, what began as kind of his populist anti-tax message. And then in 1964, Reagan co-chaired Barry Goldwater's campaign in California. And so he used that popularity to run for governor. That popularity he started to get out from hosting the General Electric show and then serving as campaign chair for Goldwater in California. And he eventually served as as governor of California between 1966 and 1972. He really actually had a mixed record as a conservative when he was governor. He did embrace that law and order rhetoric that we start to see with Barry Goldwater in 1964, and it becomes really kind of the center of conservatism. And he put it into practice on college campuses. In 1969, he sent the National Guard to Berkeley to remove students who were trying to stop the university from building a new building on a vacant piece of land. And there, the National Guard bayoneted one bystander and killed that person and blinded another. He also ran in part on his opposition to fair housing legislation, borrowing, Barry Goldwater, when he ran for president in 1964, had kind of a political jujitsu, right? Trying to avoid claims of racism while at the very same time opposing legislation meant to prevent overt discrimination. And this is what Reagan used when he was governor in California. But in other areas, despite kind of conservative rhetoric, he had a difficult time putting conservatism into practice. Over 8 years in office, he raised sales and income tax by 50%. Concerning welfare, he compromised with liberals in new legislation that did reduce welfare recipients by 300,000, but increased actual welfare payments for the people still on it. He restricted gun rights, signing the Mulford Act, which prohibited carrying loaded weapons in public. Right? He challenged anti-homosexuality activists, fighting against a law that would ban homosexual teachers from California's public schools. And if we look at his record as president, he had similar problems putting conservatism into practice. So let's just evaluate his legacy a little bit. Right? He ran for president on a plan to slash tax rates and the size of government. And so he succeeded early in office in his first year with the Economic Recovery Tax Bill of 1981. It slashed tax rates by about 27%, which projected would reduce total government revenues by $280 billion over the next 3 years. Reagan said that the loss would be more than covered by taxes on all that new investment and new growth that would come from this tax relief. But by January 1982, unemployment was at 9.7%, the highest rate since the Great Depression. By November, 9 million Americans were out of work. 17,000 businesses had failed, the second highest figure since 1933. And he quickly scaled back his 1981 tax cuts with the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982 and added federal taxes on gasoline. And one of his aides actually called this the greatest single tax hike in American history. Also, despite running on lowering federal revenues, Reagan did not significantly lighten the load of the nation's overall tax load. In 1981, 19.4% of national income was diverted to federal taxes. By 1989, that figure was 19.3%. He also failed to reduce the size of the federal government, and in modifying the basic structures of New Deal federal spending as a percentage of gross domestic product. That actually rose in the 1980s before falling back to roughly the same level in 1989, about 22%. The number of government workers increased at a faster rate during Reagan's administration than during Carter's administration. Spending on social programs aimed particularly at the poor were slashed, and an estimated $70 billion was transferred from domestic to military spending, right? Yet total expenditures on all social welfare programs, including Social Security and medical care, still actually rose between 1981 and 1989. On social issues such as federal protection of abortion, restoring prayer in public schools, reversing the trend toward the toleration of homosexuality, all of these things that conservatives were really concerned about, the Reagan administration did virtually nothing besides offering a bunch of speeches. Reagan also came into office claiming that he would end affirmative action, but he was actually surprised once he came into office that he was receiving angry letters from CEOs that refused to support the end of any sort of race-based hiring policies. And so in the end, he failed to deconstruct affirmative action programs. And overall, the economy grew at a slower rate in the 1980s than in the 1960s and 1970s. GDP was actually lower than during Carter's 4 years, and much of the prosperity of the 1980s was centralized at the very top. And one of the legacies of the 1980s is that it saw a reversal of the expanding middle class of the post-war period. The share of the nation's wealth held by the top 1% actually grew from 22% in 1979 to 39% in 1989. In terms of the Cold War, historians are kind of still debating whether Reagan's policies had anything to do with the end of the Cold War. Many historians see the emergence of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 as really the most important factor in the end of the Cold War. Reagan's popularity is really a symbol of conservatism that has only really come in recent decades. While he was president, he often received poor ratings in public opinion polls. For most of his presidency, an average of just 44% of respondents believed that the country was headed in the right direction, roughly the same overall average for the entire period between 1979 and middle of 2004. Regarding the economy, only once during the boom years of 1985 to 1989 did 50% or more of Americans register approval. So what conservative victories did Reagan actually score during his presidency? Well, Reagan put anti-unionism into practice when he broke the PATCO strike of 1981. The percentage of private sector non-agricultural workforce that was unionized fell from 20.4% in 1980 to 12.1% a decade later, the lowest figure since 1915. Reagan's longest lasting legacy, probably, though, is one that we really don't think about. That's in the federal judiciary. He appointed 3 new associate Supreme Court justices and elevated 1 to Chief Justice. He also appointed 368 district and appeals court judges, more than any president in history up until that time. And his appointments accounted for nearly half the judgeships in the lower federal courts. Importantly, he also changed the ways presidents chose justices. Before he became president, the customary method was treating judicial appointments as kind of patronage awards, political bargaining chips, or bipartisan bows to individual competence. Instead, the Reagan administration began vetting candidates strictly on ideological criteria. Right? It reinvigorated conservatism on the federal bench, but it also politicized the process of appointing federal judges and helped further partisan polarization. He also further broke up Democrats' voting base, which had depended on white working class voters. Right? Reagan helped convince a significant portion of the white working class Americans that high taxes on the wealthy and corporations, that Democrats' backing of unions, and that spending on social welfare programs were what was actually causing American industry to decline. So Reagan left a mixed legacy. If we look at national policies over the last 30 years, we can see the impact of modern liberalism and conservatism, right? Historians often call the late 20th century the age of Reagan, suggesting that conservatism dominated politics. But this view also overlooks the fact that many of liberalism's fundamental programs, right, had some staying power. And so if we look at another way to look at this legacy is to think about its impact on the Democratic Party. And so if we look at, Bill Clinton will win the 1992 and 1996 presidential elections, but he's part of a centrist left that pushes the Democratic Party to the right in order to win elections and still preserve some of the liberalism of the New Deal. And so your textbook briefly touches on this, calling these people the New Democrats. And so while these Democrats work to preserve some elements of liberalism, they also look more like moderate conservatives on many issues. And so I've included in this folder the 1992 Democratic Party platform as a supplementary primary source that you don't have to read, but you can use it in your final exam if you'd like to. And so I just want to point out some of the pieces of the platform that will help you understand how these new Democrats look more like moderate conservatives. And so listen to this statement from the platform on the national deficit. So the platform says, addressing the deficit requires fair and shared sacrifice of all Americans for the common good. In 12 Republican years, a national debt that took 200 years to accumulate has been quadrupled. Rising interest on that debt now swallows one tax dollar in 7. In place of the Republican supply-side disaster, the Democratic investment, economic conversion, and growth strategy will generate more revenue from a growing economy. We must also tackle spending by putting everything on the table, eliminating non-productive programs, achieving defense savings, reform entitlement programs to control soaring healthcare costs, cut federal administrative costs by 3% annually for 4 years, limit increases in the present budget to the rate of growth in the average American's paycheck, apply a strict pay-as-you-go rule to new non-investment spending, and make the rich pay their fair share in taxes. Listen to this statement on welfare from the platform. Welfare should be a second chance, not a way of life. We want to break the cycle of welfare by adhering to 2 simple principles. No one who is able to work can stay on welfare forever, and no one who works should live in poverty. We will continue to help those who cannot help themselves. We will offer people on welfare a new social contract. We'll invest in education and job training and provide the child care and health care they need to go to work and achieve long-term self-sufficiency. We will give them the help they need to make the transition from welfare to work and require people who can work to go to work within 2 years in available jobs either in the private sector or in community service to meet unmet needs. This will restore the covenant that welfare was meant to be, a promise of temporary help for people who have fallen on hard times. So finally, listen to this statement on crime. And we're going to learn more about the politics of crime in one of our next lectures, but keep this statement in mind from the Democratic platform. Crime is a relentless danger to our communities. Over the last decade, crime has swept through our country at an alarming rate. During the 1980s, more than 200,000 Americans were murdered, 4 times the number who died in Vietnam. Violent crimes rose by more than 16% since 1988 and nearly doubled since 1975. Our country today, a murder is committed every 25 minutes, a rape every 6 minutes, a burglary every 10 seconds. The pervasive fear of crime disfigures our public life and diminishes our freedom. To empower America's communities, Democrats pledged to restore government as the upholder of basic law and order for crime-ravaged communities. The simplest and most direct way to restore order in our cities is to put more police on the streets. So it's important to remember, right, that the power of modern conservatism doesn't just transform the Republican Party, it also transforms the Democratic Party.